everyone's understanding of the world is structured by their material experience. To maintain yourself, to stay in kind of middle class, upper middle class, white dominated space, kind of socially structured not seeing was materially built into the landscape. It's through the interstates and the suburbs.
Hi, this is Mish Hancock, and you are listening to MichMash, a place where I get to talk to the weird, wacky, wonderful people of this world, people I adore and want to know more about. Today, my guest is Walter Johnson. Walter is a Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard. He is the author of The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis, and the Violent History of the United States. Hello, Walter. Welcome.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm
So
going to try and be weird, wacky, and wonderful.
then you're perfect for this. This is what I knew about you. So I knew
All
you'd be
right.
perfect for this show. But I met you because of TEDx St. Louis. And you and Tefpo did an interview at one of our virtual events. Do you want to talk to that? What was that experience like?
It's always nice to talk with Tough, and I have learned an enormous amount both about St. Louis and about political struggle from him. So it was fun. It was as you remember, it was technologically out of control. So a lot of it was kind of hilarious.
It's a whole new world trying to figure out how to do these events online.
Right. No, that was, I'm not going to be able to reconstruct it, but there was the particularly nice and earnest social scientist who had arranged a music, and basically his music played over his entire presentation. So that was fun.
We're working on it.
Yeah. I do it low tech, like this is, I don't even try the share screen thing.
No, not for you.
No, not for me. Not for me.
I get it. So, are you from St. Louis or?
No, I'm originally from Columbia.
St. Louis. Okay.
Yeah, I grew up in Columbia, and I traveled to St. Louis a lot as a child. I have an aunt and uncle who live in St. Louis, with whom my family was very close. So we went to St. Louis a lot, but mostly to their house, which was in University City during the time I was small, and then they moved to various. They were in Ladue for a while, and then to Clayton, and now they're back in University City.
Gotcha.
And we used to. Some of my earliest, I think, and most intense childhood memories are of the zoo. I was obsessed with Marlin Perkins. I was a regular viewer of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and I actually have a very vivid visual memory of one time seeing Marlin Perkins at the zoo.
Really?
Yeah.
So, oh my gosh.
Tell you a little bit about how old I am.
Well, I think I'm probably there with you, sir. So were you going to the zoo when they used to have all the shows, when they had the sea lion shows and all of that?
Yeah, I think my parents were probably a little bit too cheap or I don't know what they were. What I remember most vividly about the zoo, I remember the big cat enclosures, of course, but was the train. Like that was the special thing.
Yes.
It was the zoo train, and I remember having the tickets, which were probably maybe 4x6, almost like little postcards. I remember taking those home as souvenirs. And of course it was, I started going there, this must have been the early 70s. And so the highway culture still seemed like it was inflected with the highway world of the 40s or 50s. And so a big landmark for me, a place that I only went once in my life, was Noah's Ark right there in St. Charles, right before the bridge.
Yes, that was my birthday. That was like the place I went for my birthday was Noah's Ark.
Yeah, so I think my parents took me in there one time. That was, it was memorable enough that I am, I'm 53 years old. I remember that. It was probably 45
remember
years
Noah's
ago.
Ark.
Yeah.
That was a landmark. I don't know. And then I can't remember when it went away, but
yeah,
I don't think any of it's left.
No, I think it was still there. You know, I when I was in college, I would drive back and forth a lot, and so I've driven that stretch of road a lot of times, and I think it was there through the certainly through the 80s, but maybe sometime, sometime in the 90s or right after that, they took it down.
Oh my gosh, memory. So was this sort of uh, memories of St. Louis, was that one of the reasons why you wanted to write your book
Um,
around?
I mean, almost, I guess in a different way, probably the opposite, in the sense that it came out of a kind of a being invited to St. Louis to give a talk in 2014 while the uprising in Ferguson was going on. And, I mean, I guess it is related to being from Missouri and feeling somehow shaped by and even responsible for Missouri. And I felt like I couldn't go and give a talk in St. Louis. It was at WashU without talking about what was happening. I felt called in that way because I'm a 19th century historian. Most of my training and my work is on the period before the Civil War.
Okay.
So I started at that point to look into the political economy of Ferguson, and I guess I started to drive a different way in St. Louis. It was almost as if I had never been to St. Louis. I had certainly never been to the parts of the city that I began to drive through and to see and to, I guess, habituate a little bit more. Because as you know, from living in St. Louis, St. Louis is full of what are effectively bypass routes.
Right.
There's a way to traverse the city and the county and to maintain yourself, to stay in kind of middle class, upper middle class, white dominated spaces. And so that was a kind of it was a confrontation for me, both with a different version of St. Louis, but also with my own past and the way that I in a way was seeing a place that I thought I had been to many times for the first time.
So what made you decide to go off the route you were used to?
Off the grid.
Yeah.
Like I said, I felt called. I felt like I had to talk about the political economy of Ferguson. I had to try to engage that struggle in some kind of useful way to take, whatever small measure of ability I had as a researcher and writer. And certainly, in comparison to most people, I have the luxury of time because part of my job is just to sit and read things and think about them. So to try to provide some kind of raw material for that. And I think that does probably tie to some kind of feeling, like I say, of responsibility or even debt for my own, my own upbringing, my own embeddedness in some of the structures in Missouri. But I left when I was 17. I am a proud Missourian, but I left Missouri when I was 17, and I really didn't ever think of coming back, and nor did I think about working on the history of Missouri. I remember, as I went through graduate school, my mother, God bless her soul, would send me books, Missouri history. I mean, these, annals of Missouri, et cetera, et cetera. And
Really?
I would just, I'd kind of put them on the shelf and not read them. It was not something I really wanted to engage, but all of a sudden I felt called. And that's been interesting. It's been interesting to read about and understand in a different way certain kinds of events that were at the edge of my consciousness when I was growing up, patterns of history that were, I think, repeated or also happened in Columbia, where I'm from, that I hadn't, fully understood. I had only dimly understood that I perhaps should have understood better. I make a lot in the book about Harland Bartholomew, who was the urban planner who so profoundly shaped St. Louis, and I think was had a profoundly negative effect on the history of Black St. Louis. And it's only been about 6 weeks or a month ago, I discovered that Harland Bartholomew actually was responsible for the urban, quote, renewal of Harland Bartholomew and Associates. His firm was responsible for the urban renewal in Columbia, where I'm from, tearing down the black neighborhood in Columbia and replacing it
Really?
effectively with parking lots. And so, I think there's a lot of this history that I wrote that has shadowed my own life, and that in ways both obvious and not obvious I've benefited from. And so there was a kind of a effort to think that through.
So I have to admit, I've never heard of Harlan Bartholomew. Is that unusual to not hear about him, or?
Not if you're not obsessed with the history of urban planning.
Okay,
If you're
gotcha.
if you're interested in the history of urban planning, he's a major figure in the planning history of the United States, and he's a major figure in the history of St. Louis. Who the footprint of the city of St. Louis, where the roads go, where the parks are, where what's single family housing, what's zoned for industry, et cetera. But particularly the outline of the interstate highways and where urban renewal ultimately occurred is based on a 1947 comprehensive plan that Bartholomew did. So he had I think the way that people refer to him is as one of the leading urban planners in the United States, whose laboratory was St. Louis. That's where he tried out
Really?
his ideas. Yeah.
So it's the same in other cities, because that's one of the things that I've always found interesting is there are things happening in your own backyard. You never see them. Those
Yeah.
people are not the people I see when I go shopping or where I drive to and what have you. And I do see that as an issue, because if you don't see it and someone doesn't bring it to your attention, which you obviously did in the book, then how do you know? It's not
Yeah.
talked about. It's not common knowledge. And so did he use St. Louis as his laboratory and then took that across the United States, or?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say. So Bartholomew was interested in transportation, particularly automobiles, and in single family housing. And so if we try to imagine how it is that particular form of social blindness that you're describing, that kind of socially structured not seeing, was materially built into the landscape. It's through the interstates and the suburbs, and that was Bartholomew's his particular genius was for that type of planning. Another example, a Bartholomew imagined project is the metro in Washington D.C., which again is allows suburbanites to commute into the city and then out to single family homes. And
Yeah.
so I 100% agree with the notion that our everyone's understanding of the world is structured by their material experience. And we need to then think about the material experience of our lives, and not just in St. Louis, but in the United States, as being structured by inequality, by systems that were materially built into the world, that were designed to shield and protect white privilege from confrontation with Black people and ultimately with Black poverty.
So when you went off the grid, as you say, where did you drive?
I started just driving straight lines, rather than so right. If you drive a straight line from Ferguson to downtown St. Louis, you drive through North St. Louis. You drive first of all by Bellefontaine Cemetery and where Dred Scott is buried, right there on West Ferguson Avenue, right? And so I became obsessed with these different interesting proximities. The proximity of the place where Dred Scott is buried to the uprising in Ferguson, or the proximities of Pine Lawn, right? So Pine Lawn is the place where William Clark, the explorer, had his sort of out of the city farm. It's a place where he signed numerous dispossessive treaties with Native American nations in the period where he was the superintendent of the United States Indian Agency. And Pine Lawn, is, you know, you'll know, was the site of the largest small arms production plant in the world at the time of the Second World War. And it was a place where there was a lot of labor struggle, particularly struggle by African American activists to get employed in defense industries, to which they were, you know, the defense industry was legally integrated by President Roosevelt. And so there was a big struggle during the Second World War, Black workers trying to get defense jobs. And then Pine Lawn was later the place where Paul McCulloch, the St. Louis police officer who was sort of famously shot in the Pruitt-Igoe housing project, grew up. Robert McCulloch, the prosecutor, grew up there. But Pine Lawn is also the place where Michael Brown's family is from, right? And, you know, and interestingly, also the place where my aunt grew up. And so those sorts of layered proximities struck me as interesting and almost uncanny, as if the proximity of Dred Scott and the Ferguson uprising, or of William Clark and the small arms factory, or of the McCulloch family and the Brown family, and indeed my own family, were trying to tell me something. And so it was really that I became,
it's like you were being
obsessed
led there.
with. Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't want to be too goofy about it, but it seemed to me like there's something about those proximities that I wanted to try to communicate in a way that's, you know, not quite rational.
So when and how did you meet Tef?
So I started out, you know, as I said, I started out doing this this project on the political economy of Ferguson, and part of that was looking at tax abatements. So, you know, the thing that initially struck me and continues to strike me about Ferguson is the question: well, how is it that you can have a city that is so short of revenue that they're reverting to what's effectively a medieval model of revenue extraction, right? They are taxing poor pilgrims on the road. This is how castles raised revenue in the medieval period. Wow. Right? So they're giving out these tickets to poor Black motorists.
Right.
When at the same time they have Emerson Electric right in the city limits. You have a Fortune 500 company in the city limits. So, you know, it was a naive question, but the question is how? And so I was trying to learn about tax abatements and, you know, who was getting tax abatements and how they were getting them. And I was watching various both the city council meetings and the county meetings online. And at one of those meetings, and I don't really remember which it was. I always think it was the Ferguson City Council meeting. I think Tuff thinks it was a county meeting. I saw him right during the uprising, right? Because I was doing this work in, say, September and October of 2014, at a meeting, just reading the people out. You know, truth telling in a way that was eloquent and passionate and pointed. And I thought, well, you know, this is an energy and insight that I think that people at Harvard, where I work, I think people here need to learn about this. And so I invited him here to give a talk, and it was, you know, a lot of people, high energy, great insight, and we became friends after that. Just, you know, sort of. I was spending more time in St. Louis. You know, at some point, probably right around the time he came and gave that talk, I decided to actually go ahead, and my wife had to like urge me for like 2 months to actually write a book about St. Louis. I had thought I would just do this thing on Ferguson as a kind of a one-off.
Right.
And you know, so I ended up traveling out there a little bit more, and you know, we just became friends through that.
Gotcha. Very cool. So, is there anything else? I mean, for the people out there who haven't yet read your book that would surprise them about? I mean, I'm surprised
Yeah.
about, I have been surprised about Ferguson and that whole idea of giving tickets to people that can't afford the tickets. And now they're on this treadmill of if they, unfairly getting more tickets and then now they're in jail. And it's just, it's so messy and it just amazes me that this happens.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is actually indicative of a particular moment in the economy of what I would call the history of racial capitalism at this point, where because of number one, the flight of work and industry in the first instance to the suburbs,
Mm-hmm.
and number two, the flight of capital overseas. A lot of people who once um, were necessary to the workings of capital in the United States have been rendered surplus. And I think that what you see in a place like Ferguson, North County, North City, and the United States in general are different kinds of strategies emerging to take advantage of those people economically, nevertheless, right? So not through exploitative employment, but actually through forms of extraction. So payday loans, for-profit
Right.
policing,
Yeah.
and finally, I see mass incarceration as another one of those forms of extraction, where the incarceration of poor and black and predominantly poor black people for in many cases meaningless crimes provides jobs for white prison guards and for
Right.
white construction workers in rural communities. And so I try and make a connection in the book between the expansion of incarceration in Missouri and the rural positioning. The disposition of state prisons in Missouri is almost entirely in tiny little towns that even I, as a Missourian who used to follow high school sports, I hadn't, heard of a lot of these places. And so there's an economy there where the value is being extracted from urban black populations and redistributed to rural white populations. And so, yeah, so in that sense, the for-profit policing, I think, is really the, indicative of a larger moment. I think the thing that I was struck by that I didn't expect to find, and that was heartening, was that there's a very long radical history in the history of St. Louis, dating back to the Civil War and even before. And I was struck by that some of the Civil War history heroes in St. Louis, whether you're talking about Franz Ziegel, who there's a statue in Forest Park of Franz Ziegel, Joseph Wedemeyer, who organized the artillery defense of the city during the Civil War. They were communists. They were actually, true life German communists.
Wow.
Wedemeyer was a close friend of Karl Marx and a publisher of some of Marx's most important work. And so following that history up through the general strike of 1877 in the city and through the mutual support and organizing of African American women and communists in the 1930s, African Americans, particularly women and communists in the 1930s, and then seeing some of that energy and organizing carried through the struggles in the 60s around Jefferson Bank, or the different employment struggles, particularly things led by Percy Green, and I would argue even up through Ferguson. That was new information to me and exciting. As a I think of myself as being a kind of a politically extreme person on the left, and so to find that radical history in the Midwest was felt like coming home a little bit to me.
That is, this is all news to me. That is,
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's an amazing history. Yeah.
wow. Whew.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have their statues. Awesome.
Yeah, there's a right. Well, don't tell anybody. They have a 25-foot statue of a communist in Forest Park, but
This doesn't seem
but
like
it's
a good
there.
idea to me,
Yeah.
but I don't, that doesn't
Yeah.
work in my world.
Yeah.
Wow. And so, okay, gosh, that got me. Okay, so any signs that things are going in the right direction?
Well, I mean, I see signs all over the city. You know, the book ends with an epilogue about people who are doing, I think, small, beautiful things in the city of St. Louis, creating what I imagine to be fragments of a better future. And you know, it's generally just because of the way that I think about politics and the way that I think about justice. It's sometimes those visionary projects that I look to almost more than anything else.
Okay.
I think people in St. Louis are justly proud of electing the progressive prosecutors, Kim Gardner and Wesley Bell. I think I think there's a limit, to be quite honest, to what a progressive prosecutor can do. And without any disrespect to them, I think that the level of opposition and animosity that they have encountered after their election and of non-cooperation from the police departments, the police union, and other elected officials, including the mayor, is indicative of a deeper struggle, that the struggle reaches beyond the ability to elect progressive prosecutors. You know, that's a struggle that I see still emblematized in the disparities in, you know, the COVID rates or the spatial and racial disparities. You know, like anybody else, I don't know about like anybody else, but like many of the people who are my friends, so I guess it's not like anybody else. I think Cori Bush is a extraordinary and inspiring figure, and so that's certainly, I think, something that people have to take seriously, her election, and certainly there's a generation of young Black activists who have come out of the Ferguson uprising, like Cori Bush, like Kayla Reed, like Derica Purnell, like Tef Poe, many others who are building on the work of people like Jamala Rogers and Percy Green. And I think that's exciting.
That's good. We need that.
Absolutely.
We need that.
Yeah.
So, in your book, I have some really specific questions I wanted
Yeah.
to ask you, and it was described as a personal reckoning, as partly a personal reckoning. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what they're saying is, you know, that I can't remember if that was like a blurb or if that's something the press wrote. I mean, there are moments in the book where I try to be forthright about the fact that, you know, I'm a white person, I'm a white man from Missouri, and so a lot of this is my history. And there are, you know, whether you're talking about the patterns of school funding or school segregation or anxiety about real estate or simply the inheritance value of real estate and the way that wealth is passed from one generation to another through home ownership. These are all things that you know, these are all part of my life.
Right.
And also the kind of what you were talking about, the sort of structured blindness, the, you know, the incomplete sort of ability to understand things where there are small signs of meanness or injustice. And, you know, growing up, I think they're definitely either lacking curiosity or replacing curiosity about the way the world works with ideology, particularly white supremacist ideology, i.e., let's blame people for their own condition instead of trying to understand the history that made the world. Or then, you know, probably honestly for me, a certain kind of flight, right? I mean, I left Missouri at 17, And I didn't necessarily want to come back and own it. There was something to me that was very appealing for a long portion of my life about just being, and I liked places where everyone was from somewhere else. I loved living in New York City. I actually loved living in California, where I didn't necessarily feel like an insider or an outsider. I just felt kind of rootless, and that a lot of people there were rootless, and so I think for me, part of at least the energy and maybe even some of the anger that's in the book comes from a kind of a reckoning with my own past. I mean, there's a strange way in which the person whose work both and just I don't know what the word would be, triggered me the most as I did the research for the book, and also spoke to me the most was Jonathan Franzen, who's from St. Louis, who writes beautifully about St. Louis and about a childhood not dissimilar from mine, about the church group and the corduroy pants and the material culture, all very, very familiar to me, but with a kind of occlusion, a kind of a limit of vision, a kind of an inability to see beyond in his case, the city limits of Webster Groves, that I both could remember as my own way of seeing and wanted to decry as a limited, partisan, race, class, gender stipulated way of seeing.
So is this also what led you to be a professor of African and African American studies?
Um, I mean, I think it's at some point I've always been obsessed with meanness, and I think gradually, in a way, my understanding of meanness became more historical and more political and more structured around the questions of racial capitalism. And that didn't, you could argue it happened to me late in life, but probably in graduate school at some point, the woman who became my advisor, who's an intellectual stalwart hero of mine, Nell Painter, she convinced me in a way that if you weren't wrestling with the history of, in my case at that point, slavery, but if you weren't wrestling with the history of white supremacy and capitalism, of racial capitalism in the United States, that you were evading the history. You were, you weren't really facing what the history was about. And so that was the pathway. I think that it is yes, I think it was a pathway that was shaped by things that I saw as a child and knew were wrong, even though all of the, not all of the adults, because my mother was certainly a righteous woman, and my father was in his own way a very, very righteous person. But many of the adults who were construed to be the moral authorities in the society seemed, either oblivious or supportive of things that my own kind of sense of right and wrong that was based in my house, and in my church was telling me, how is it that these people are saying this? How is it that they're calling themselves Christians? And then they allow the world to look like this. Right. And I think I had a hard time sitting with that. And I guess in a way I still do. So I have a very another person I admire a great deal is an activist named Phil Agnew, who I've become friends with. And he says he came to the work from, first his heart, and then his feet, and then his head, meaning that he felt that things were wrong, and then he got involved in the struggle, and then book learning followed. And for me, it was slightly different. That I in my heart, I could the meanness. I was always obsessed with meanness, and that's not to say that I didn't ever, that I wasn't ever mean or fallen myself, but and then I did a lot of book learning, and then gradually I started to try to engage more forthrightly. And so part of the project in St. Louis has been to try to develop a fuller spectrum of engagement with the city, and to try, not just to write a book about it, but to try to help out in some tiny way. And that, rightly or wrongly, I may have been giving myself too much credit. That's what I started with the Ferguson article, was like, well, here's something that I can see because of the way that I've been taught to see,
Right.
and that I have the time to do the research on, and that I feel like other people need to know, right? Because there was all this, if you go back and look at the visual history of the uprising in Ferguson, it's almost as if the photographers and the camera people for the networks were deliberately excluding Emerson Electric from their shots, because it just didn't make sense,
Really?
right? It
Wow.
visually
Okay.
doesn't make sense to
Right.
have a Fortune 500 company in a place that they were trying to represent as, this urban America, right? As
Right.
this kind of impoverished and abandoned place. And I would argue that in many ways Ferguson is impoverished and abandoned. But what's a Fortune 500 company doing?
Right.
The optics are messed up.
You said something there. You said how you were taught to see things, and it makes me think about how we are taught history, which is pretty whitewashed.
Mhm.
I mean, has there been any movement in teaching our children more of history seen through the eyes of people that are not white? You know,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that there is, but I think it's, I think that it's difficult to figure out how to expose children to our history, which is so violent. And so I think what you see is a confrontation and effort to treat those things in a manner that may or may not be fully forthright or appropriate at early age, that then falls away. And so in many states, the history of slavery is taught in fourth grade and not after. Right. And so,
right,
what can,
right,
and so I think there's a lot of, I think there are a lot of well-intended efforts, certainly, and in a way, I think that some of my children have learned wonderful things about wonderful and powerful ideas about history in the schools. But I think that on the one hand, these have been, I think, bitterly resented by a certain stratum of white people who think that these, I mean, more or less, you can see this in the struggle over something like a Columbus monument, who think
right,
that they're somehow being personally persecuted or dragged through the mud if we try to have a forthright conversation about history. Um, and I think that's produced a kind of a reactionary tendency. So, ultimately, I think that you just have to tell the truth,
right,
and you have to tell the truth. So Lewis and Clark were actually on a kind of a military and economic reconnaissance mission for the U.S. Army, and that's just the truth, right?
yeah,
That's not language. That's like, that's not a dirty trick to say that.
right,
Many of the leading figures of the early republic, used words like exterminate when they talked about Native Americans. Well, okay, that's just genocide, right? I mean,
right,
that's what it is. That's not ideological or particularly ideological. That's just telling the truth. Abraham Lincoln was himself a member of the Illinois State Militia who fought in the Black Hawk War. Okay, so he was a settler militiaman. That's just what he was, right?
right,
And
right,
so that, to me, I think that um, yeah, that maybe there's a little bit of there's a deficit of truth telling at the higher levels of the society, that, you know, we can't necessarily blame elementary school teachers for not being able to fully manage that.
Sure. Very interesting. Oh my gosh, Walter, thank you.
All right. Well, that was fun. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, and
Yeah, it's
that was
always
I so appreciate your time. I mean, you're giving me a lot to think about.
all right. Well, it's always fun to talk about St. Louis.
I love it very much. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
And
All right.
where can people buy your book? Amazon, I'm guessing.
Amazon, they have it. Also, if you're in St. Louis, I'd say Left Bank Books, right? I mean, Left Bank Books is kind of they're keeping it afloat through the pandemic, but
Good.
that's a good place to hit them.
Absolutely. Well,
All
thank
right.
you, sir. You have a great
Okay.
day.
All right.
Everyone
Take
out
care.
there, I'm just going to close real quick. You've been listening to Mishmash out there. Please have wonderful days, and we love